more control over some things that we think are quite important here. I think things like, for example, immigration are quite important for Scotland to think about in its own context. And I think what the Yes campaign and the SNP in particular need to do is say, well, actually, let's move away from individual little policies to offering a much more comprehensive argument of saying this is why Scotland itself should be independent. What is it that we cannot do now that we want to do, and what is it that everyone else says we can't do because we're too wee, whereas actually we can, and move away from individual policies on individual little things.
What do you think, Michael? I mean, there is this argument out there when you hear it on Twitter, you see it on blogs, which is that this whole thing is abject moonshine, that the kind of conversation that Caron would like us to have would be a great idea, might be a good thing, might transform the United Kingdom, but it simply isn't in the nature of the British state to permit this kind of conversation, never mind to actually serious-mindedly reform itself into this structure. It's not going to happen. That's the kind of nationalist argument. Are you convinced by that?
Any kind of structural reforms in time might bring a kind of reform in mentality, but I think what you're projecting with your original question that might be a problem. I think it's a good area to campaign on for the Yes campaign, and they're just not doing it because, for example, I'm not sure on the analysis that there's a strong case. If you get that devolution and all the financial powers move to Scotland, then what remains of the United Kingdom? Just this idea of a bigger entity in international affairs. And what's that? That's the opportunity to be America's, what Noam Chomsky memorably defined as America's attack dog. Or the bigger representation in the United Nations where they're already sort of marginalised, or in Europe where they're already hated by the other major groups. I mean, we get the there's the special relationship with America where we get the special privilege of pretending we were in on the decision when it was made, but that's about it. I mean, I think this is actually a strong area they could be campaigning on, rather than a weak one.
My friend Adam Ramsey entirely agrees with you. He's a green guy, and his argument for having a second question, actually, when this referendum was founded, was, well, look at what you're left defending if you support independence being all of the fiscal powers and Devo Max being everything apart from foreign affairs and defence. Who wants to defend Britain as a unity on the basis of its policies on foreign affairs and policies on defence? Caron, do you want to defend Britain on that basis?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of... I do think it's quite compelling that by staying in a reformed union, we can have the best of both worlds. Because I do think that we have more influence abroad. We're already part of a United Kingdom that is delivering on its 0.7% overseas aid target. I'm not convinced that an independent Scotland would either have the influence or the ability to contribute on that level. And in terms of the Trident argument, I don't want nuclear submarines anywhere on these islands or in the world, to be honest. I just want rid of the whole lot of them, and we are much more likely to get that by being part of the UK.
I don't see
contributing to global disarmament.
But if the UK state has no interest in global disarmament, which it doesn't, as it tends to fund a lot of the dodgier regimes around the world, not fund necessarily, it's not fund, arm a lot of the dodgy regimes around the world. I'm not sure how that works.
But it's about as I say, you are more likely to have more influence for Scots in the world internationally as part of the United Kingdom. And in terms of the independence argument, the SNP have not. Actually, they're trying to pretend that nothing really would change, but it would be radically different. What happens to people's pensions? I mean, my husband is now in his early 60s. He's going to be retiring soon. What happens to the pension that he's paid into all these years? They haven't explained that. Even simple things like, when our passports expire, what's going to happen? And how are we going to pay? They're making a series of hugely optimistic projections on what they're going to get in from oil revenues, which suits their case, but they are vastly different from what the independent Office of Budget Responsibility and the UK government says. you have to. Norway takes a very cautious approach when they're projecting their oil revenues, but the SNP seems to be saying, as usual, okay, it's all going to be fine, and you can't make an argument like that because people aren't going to believe it. They want concrete facts.
But on the UK foreign policy argument, the idea of the UK as a state that as a bigger entity can project more good onto the world. I mean, it's a nice idea, but at the moment, maybe I'm a great deal more cynical about UK foreign policy than yourself, but I think they do an incredible amount of damage and bad things around the world. And I think one of the reasons for independence would be one of the ways you can do good is by stopping doing bad, and that would be a good thing for Scotland.
But Lynn Featherstone, the Liberal Democrat International Development Minister, is the government's champion for stopping violence against women and girls. She's putting massive amounts of money and overseas aid into tackling that on an international level.
But at the same time, David Cameron's selling money to Saudi Arabia, selling guns to Saudi Arabia. Sorry.
I don't think Scots would be able to have that impact on trying to change the culture, because one of the most important things that you can do is free women and girls from the tyranny of rape, of violence, to give them their freedom so that they can contribute as equal members of society. We wouldn't have the influence to do that in an independent Scotland. And I mean, that's one of the things that you're asking earlier, what keeps me in? And I actually remember writing to Lynn Featherstone at the time of the infamous tuition fees vote, because she's also been involved in things like body confidence and body image for girls, and she was also working then on violence against women and also on equal marriage. And I wrote to her at the time and I said, it's more important that you're in the government doing that kind of stuff.
I think one of the interesting things about how we view UK in the world and how we might view an independent Scotland in the world is that the UK perhaps has a critical size where it can do things, for lack of a better way of putting this, on its own, on an international level, when it does direct certain resources in certain ways. I think what Scotland can do and what many other nations do is work in partnership. And I don't think any of the objectives that we have in terms of international aid are not shared by a number of other countries, where a number of different ideas and people can come together. And perhaps a partnership approach dealing with a number of things would be just as effective, if not more so, when it comes to dealing with the issues that you just raised, Caron. So I don't think that Scotland will lose influence in terms of an overall agenda. It might lose the ability to do it itself, if that's what we really want to do. But I think in terms of international work, we want to do things together. We saw recently, last week, about the International Arms Treaty, not going forward because of a protest for a few countries. But that's actually going to go to a much bigger UN vote, where the overall effect will be to reverse the smaller decision. And I think that that's the type of thing that happens at an international level, where you can build consensus and actually then make the difference when you do that, rather than just going alone.
Is there an aspect of this which is about the extent to which it's like a kind of balance sheet, if I can take a kind of crude metaphor, and there are many good things and many bad things about most governments. They have virtues and vices, and the same is true about the benefits and costs and challenges and opportunities of having big and small states. And actually, it seems to me that quite often this debate about the Constitution, and maybe debates about the politics of coalition too, would be enhanced by having a bit of more of a sensibility about the extent to which it's not all good and all bad, that actually there are opportunities and challenges which are different. There are challenges which face the UK which don't face or wouldn't face an independent Scotland, and vice versa. And maybe we'd all be enhanced if we thought about this debate more in that kind of way than about sort of saying that all the goods on one side and all the bads on the other.
Completely agree.
That's a reasonable point. I mean, I'm not suggesting everything that Britain does abroad is bad, but there is a lot of it that is, and a lot of it that simply doesn't go reported. The hypocrisy. Afghanistan was a feminist war to liberate the women, and at the same time, your best friends are Saudi Arabia, which is not exactly a feminist paradise, is it?
Not as far as I'm aware. No.
Indeed not.
I think it's an interesting one though, and I kind of must say my sympathies are sort of more with Michael. I can see that it's important what quality of force and influence you project, not simply what quantity. And I think there are ways in which you have to think about some phenomena, some particular manifestations of public affairs and politics in international relations are more significant than others, and that I'd rather have a smaller Scotland which didn't have nuclear weapons. And also there's a financial argument about Trident, which I suppose we didn't really get into, but it's not simply about unilateral disarmament, but it is about contributions in the context of austerity to a large-scale military kind of installation, which we can probably ill afford. And that's maybe a supplement to what you were saying there, Caron.
When I've always thought that it's not about what we should be talking about is the sort of values we want to see in Scotland, and work out how to deliver them with whatever constitutional settlement we end up with, because I don't think independence is the answer to everything. I don't think necessarily the UK has the answer to everything. We need to work out what we as Scots want to deliver and get on with delivering it. But what really annoys me is the cynical attempt of Salmond to manipulate Scotland's women by coming out with we can sort out childcare after independence. What nonsense! And that was just weeks after he had knocked back Willie Rennie on providing nursery education for 2-year-olds. It was crude, it was cynical, and I'm so angry with them because they could be doing stuff now. They have the power to do stuff now, and they're not using it. They're also, they had 400 million from the UK government for infrastructure projects, and they're squirreling it away. Why? They should be using it now to boost their economy. They have the power to do it now. And I'm just losing patience with the idea that we're having to, it's almost like government on hold till after the 18th of September 2014. I mean, there are people who are sick, there are kids, there are people who need a proactive government looking after them now.
But the thing is, Caron, I mean, I know that your own position presumably is that you would favour substantial expanded powers to Holyrood, possibly greater powers for them to do this. So at least that's the mechanism you envisage to deliver these things. But I think in fairness to the SNP, in fairness to their funding structures, money isn't everything, but money is an awful lot. And they are in straitjackets here. There isn't this opportunity to expand all of these desirable, potentially social programmes under the present settlement. And I think critically, there isn't an obvious story emanating from the parties, the Lib Dems, the Tories and the Labour Party, about empowering Scotland to make these decisions. There wasn't in the Calman Commission. There was a great deal of hostility to the kind of more federal home rule structures that you might be in favour of. And so I think it is a reasonable question to say, well, actually, in the present straitjacket, we can't actually do many of these things that we'd want to do. And that's one very good argument for independence if home rule doesn't look like a goer, doesn't look like a realistic possibility as opposed to a fond fantasy, basically. Douglas, I don't know if that's something which resonates with you at all.
To an extent, I mean, I am sympathetic actually to Karen's point of view there, that the SNP do still run the government in Scotland. They do have a majority. What they want to do, they can do to an extent. They are, constrained by money, but they do have all these opportunities. They do have the opportunity to look at a number of different things to deliver for Scotland just now, even whilst they plan for an independence referendum. But you do look at the pronouncements, and it's very rare you see a pronouncement, except through formal civil service issued press releases, that don't link something to the independence referendum. And they seem to forget that they wanted this long time to put forward the referendum in their white paper, etc. They got their majority in the last election, primarily based on one, good campaigning techniques, but two, a reputation for competence. I think they are actually damaging part of the Yes campaign by focusing everything on it, rather than separating out SNP the party with SNP the government. And I think that's an argument that they don't really understand, I think.
What do you think, Michael? I mean, you're not an SNP man, but does that seem like a fair critique to you?
It's something I said a couple of weeks ago, where do most of us see the SNP in action? Probably we watch Holyrood. I take it. And Douglas, Caron, are you avid watchers of FMQs?
Via Twitter.
I try not to.
Okay. But we see these kind of exchanges where they're always essentially react. So it all seems about the indie. I think it would be remarkably cynical